All right, I think we're ready to go. All right, welcome to today's user share. It's the first webinar of 2023, so I'm excited to be here. I know we've got a lot of great content we're going to get to today. This session is always very popular and jam-packed full of stuff, so I'm not going to take too terribly long to get us going. I do, however, want to let everyone know about our first two Excel events of 2023. Our first one is virtual. It's on February 9th. And then our next one will be in Houston at the Houston Zoo. Actually, I think this is the first time we've had a big event at a zoo. It should be really fun. I'll put a link in the chat in just a bit for you so you can check out the agendas for these, see what kind of sessions we're going to have, and hopefully get registered. All right, just a couple reminders. We are recording today's session. I'll send you a link to that recording tomorrow in case you need to pop out early. Also, please feel free to submit your questions at any time. There is a separate Q&A panel for you. You can type your questions in there. And then we always encourage you to interact with each other in the chat as well. Those two are separate. So questions in the Q&A pane and general chat in the chat. All right, welcome back to our webinar stage, Marius. I have Marius Sandbu. He is a cloud evangelist. He's a podcaster. He is a member of our CUGC in Norway. I've got some details about him right there for you. And I'm just gonna pass things right on over to you, Marius, because I know you have a lot to talk about today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. Yeah, this is the first time I'm hosting a webinar on Zoom, so let's make sure that we get this thing working properly. Let's try and share my screen, the right one. So there we go. So let's hope this is working okay. Yep, great. So as mentioned, welcome everyone. So my name is Marius. I work for a company called Sopastera in Norway. So I'm just gonna skip to the next slides first, but just remember that. So as mentioned, I work as a cloud evangelist, so helping organizations try and adopt public cloud services in a secure way. But most times I work a lot in the interaction between cloud and EUC, identity and security. So it's always a different mix between different technologies. And I think this is the 4th year now that I'm hosting this webinar series. So I try to wrap up all of the new updates, changes that have been going on within the EUC space for the last year. So of course, there might be things that I've been missing or some news that I forgot to mention, but it's only because I only have an hour or so. So I need to make sure that I spend enough time on the different topics that I've been adding. But if there's anything that I've been missing out on or something that I've forgot to mention, feel free to add it in the Q&A window or in the chat window so I can follow up afterwards, because I'm always curious and try to catch any relevant news that I can find. And of course, as mentioned, there's a Q&A window here. You can ask questions there or use the chat window. I have a separate screen for everything here, so I can try to answer them directly once we come to a specific topic, or you can also feel free to reach out to me on any social media platform or email where you can find me. If you don't want to listen to my rambling for the next hour, I've already uploaded the presentation on the link below, so you can find all the content that I'm going to be going through there. So with that, let's kick off with the agenda. I also added I did a last minute change and also added what many of you already might have heard of or seen or tried out, which is ChatGPT, which I'll come back to a little bit afterwards, and also talk a little bit about how I think this is going to impact us from the EUC space moving forward. Also going through the current state of things when it comes to the big vendors, so Microsoft, Citrix, and VMware. Talk about what's new within Citrix Cloud, VMware Horizon, Azure Virtual Desktop, Windows 365, and also some new services that have been announced from Microsoft. One of these new services is called Microsoft DevBox, which many of you might already heard of, but I'll go through what it is and what Microsoft is making of change, of what kind of changes Microsoft is making there. And then we have hybrid deployments, Azure AD devices and deployment architectures there. And then I have a couple of use cases that I've been working on for some customers the last couple of years, the last year, when it comes to zero trust network access. So we'll be talking a little about what kind of offerings that Citrix has, what Microsoft has, and a third-party provider. So we did a lot of research there, and what kind of what we ended up with for a specific customer that I was working on. And also we'll be talking a little bit when it comes to zero trust-based file access. So a lot of fluffy words there, but I'll try to go into the details once we get to that section of the webinar. Another thing I want to mention first before I go into the main topics, in that there are two vulnerabilities that have been now been published for the Citrix NetScaler, which affects the NetScaler gateway component. So if you haven't already updated the NetScaler appliances the last bunch, so make sure that you have these patches in place, because Citrix has already seen that there are some customers that have been impacted by or targeted by this vulnerability. And if you see on the right-hand side, there was a security researcher that did a lot of, or figured out and saw how many devices that are still have this vulnerability present as of 28th of December. So it's 2 weeks ago. Hopefully the number is going down to 0, but I don't think so. But there you have the vulnerabilities, and also try to make sure that you patch those as soon as possible if you haven't already. So ChatGPT, this is well, the term is neural language processing engine that came out of a group called OpenAI, which is heavily funded by Microsoft. And this essentially allows you to have real user interaction with machine learning engine. So you can ask it questions. So as a preparation for this webinar, I asked, okay, what's the biggest challenge that we have at EUC? So I think it provided a pretty good answer in terms of the complexity and diversity that we have of systems and devices. So, and you can of course also modify the questions that you ask and say that, okay, please provide me a shorter answer because I think it's way too much text for me to read anyway. So it of course can understand what you're asking and provide pretty good feedback as well. Now, another interesting thing about this technology is you can also ask it when it comes to system administration, development. So I asked it, okay, can you provide me with the configuration setup of end-factor authentication on NetScaler, for instance? So it also provided me with an example configuration that I can use to actually set up the end-factor authentication service on NetScaler. So it has a pretty large, pretty interesting use cases. Now, after this was launched, I think it was in the mid of December. Now Microsoft has already announced that they're moving forward and trying to integrate this service into a lot of their portfolio. So it's looking into migrating or adding it into the Microsoft Office applications. They already mentioned the search engine they have, Bing. So probably it will be useful someday, but it's going to be interesting to see how will they adopt this technology into their services. But from an EUC perspective, I see that this is going to be extremely helpful when it comes to help desk, end user support. So actually having like a better user interaction between end users when it comes to troubleshooting, instead of those more traditional chatbot services that we have today, which is more looking at specific keywords and trying to referring to a specific knowledge article or trying to give interaction in that way, in that sense. So moving on with like looking at the current state of things, I also made a like last minute change here as well, because yesterday, unfortunately, was a pretty sad day when it comes to those. There's been a lot of layoffs in Citrix, which was announced yesterday. So a lot of people that I know in Citrix now have lost their jobs. So hopefully we can, as a community, help them try to find any openings or job openings that we know of, because a lot of good people that lost their jobs yesterday. Now, in addition, of course, they made a lot of changes when it comes to the product names. The old product names are now back: Send Server, NetScaler, ShareFile. Even though I didn't actually use the new product names that they used before. So ADC and Content Collaboration was the new name for ShareFile, but the old names now are back. They even also undid the end of life for Send Mobile. So it seems to now adding more effort into revitalizing Send Mobile as a product moving forward. And Another interesting change that they made was like each of these products now are their own business units within Cloud Software Group. So NetScaler is its own business unit, ShareFile is its own business unit. Also, if I remember correctly, ZenMobile, if it's still part of the Citrix business unit. But it's going to be interesting to see how will the collaboration work between these different business units within the Cloud Software Group. But of course, it's also going to be interesting seeing moving forward now with all those layoffs and how will they be able to maintain the same level of development that they had which they have had the last year. And I also find it interesting that looking at, okay, how many are actually using Citrix on a daily basis? So I found this published on Twitter probably sometime last year. I can't remember who, but it just shows how many are actually using Citrix or any type of EDI service on a daily basis. So this is just showing how many are actually using the Citrix Gateway service, which is the hosted NetScaler gateway. So it was 46 million users only in August. I'm guessing that's not the majority of users that are using Citrix today. I'm guessing the majority is still using on-prem NetScaler appliances. And this is not adding in who is using Horizon, who is using AVD. So it's really big market when it comes to EDI services or desktop as a service, whatever you prefer to call it. So when it comes to, and then we have VMware, which was acquired by Broadcom, and like the only association that I have with Broadcom is mostly making network cards. So it's going to be interesting how a hardware company now is going to add all the components and software technologies that VMware has been building up the last 5-6 years, and what kind of strategy they have moving forward. Now, of course, given the history that Broadcom has with older software companies that they acquired with Symantec and CA, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Now, the last thing I read was that it's still pending approval when it comes to the EU. So they have like a commission now where it's looking into the merger or the acquisition, I believe. So there's the ongoing meetings there now to see what kind of or how could this be in a competitive landscape. And then we have Microsoft, of course, pushing out updates and pushing out license changes. So one of the main things that also happened, even though we don't see any big implication of that at a given time, but right now they moved the AVD product team and the Microsoft 365 product team under the same management. So it's now Scott Manchester, which is responsible for both of these product teams. So hopefully they have a more synchronized roadmap moving forward when it comes to new functionality, even though we've had that much of the same products or features today already. Of course, pushing new licenses. In December, during Ignite last year, they announced a new Microsoft Teams Premium SKU, which is providing more security functionality. We recently got information now how much it's going to cost and what kind of functionality is added, but I think it was at $10 per user per month to get access to that new functionality. And on the webinar last year, also mentioned that Microsoft is removing support for Microsoft 365 apps on Windows Server, but now they changed their mind again. And now it's supported on the last Windows Server until October 2026. Of course, if you go onto the documentation side on Microsoft, they will of course state that okay, if you want to use Microsoft 365 apps with 365 apps with continued support, you need to move to one of the following hosting services, which of course is Windows 365 or AVD. In addition, they also renamed now Endpoint Manager is now called Intune again. So they have the same product renaming disorder that most companies have. And they also now be releasing a new premium SKU for Intune, which is going to be which is scheduled to be publicly available in March. So I have some information there when it comes to what kind of functionality that is coming in that new SKU. But they also made one positive change when it comes to licenses, and that they've introduced something called Microsoft Teams Shared Device Licenses. So instead of needing to license per user, you can license per device. So let's say that you have a factory, for instance, that you need to have Teams installed for the factory workers to be able to call on Teams. That is something that can be solved with that new license SKU. Another interesting change is, of course, that Azure Active Directory now is part of a new product family called Entra. So you might see that reflected in the portal. You might see that in documentation. So all the new identity-based products now are part of the Entra product family. So making the confusion complete. But let's go a little bit more into the technical details. So let's start off with AVD and Windows 365. First off, publicly available now is ShortPath for public networks. So ShortPath is a protocol change to Microsoft that allows RDP now to use UDP-based transport instead of TCP and WebSockets, which they've been using for a long, long time. And ShortPath has been available in 2 different flavors. You either have ShortPath for managed networks, which meant that your device needed to have line of sight connectivity to the terminal server or the VDI session. That either, of course, works if you have a VPN between the device the user is coming from to the Azure infrastructure, or that your VDI server has a public IP, which of course is not something you would recommend. And with public networks now, you don't need to have a public IP address. You don't need to have direct line of sight between the client that's connecting and the VDI server on the other side. So it uses the STUN protocol to actually set up a NAT session to allow that communication to flow. And this has now been enabled by default. So you don't need to do any changes. Of course, I have seen some issues now with the latest release, so might still some bugs that need to work out, I think. The other thing is single sign-on, which of course is something a lot of customers have been asking for a long, long time. And this is now in preview for Azure AD-based devices and hybrid joint devices. I'll come back to you a little bit later when it comes to the technical details, but I've been using this some time already for Azure AD joint devices, and it works great. Only thing that I encountered was some issues when it comes to conditional access and compliant devices. And if you want to use this for hybrid devices, you need to remember that you need to create the Kerberos objects. So this is documented on the Microsoft Learn website. So you need to remember to create those objects before you turn on the single sign-on mechanism. And then we have FSLogix, which now also supports Azure AD joint devices. And this is using a new feature in Azure Active Directory called Azure AD Kerberos. Now, the problem is historically Azure Files has only supported Active Directory or traditional authentication using a key. And given that Azure AD devices doesn't support the legacy protocol, so Microsoft needed a lot of the changes there to make this work properly. So that's why they created something called Azure AD Kerberos. So that allows you to authenticate to the service using a modern authentication protocol, but it can convert the authentication process using the legacy protocols. So in order for this to work, you still need to have a hybrid identity. So meaning that you still need to have those domain controllers somewhere that is synchronizing out the users. And if you want to set up this FSLogix with hybrid joint devices, you still need to have initial line of sight to those domain controllers in order for this to work. Another thing is that Microsoft is now pushing and moving away from the traditional Active Directory Connect or the synchronization engine to sync between on-prem Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. So this is going to be replaced by a new engine now called Cloud Sync. Even though it doesn't have the same level of functionality, but this is the direction that Microsoft is moving. So I actually have a colleague of mine that wrote on a pretty deep dive article about terms of functionality and how to set this up using the new cloud engine, and also what kind of services that are not supported on the new cloud engine at the moment. Other things from IVD, you now have support for private links, which means that the VDI sessions or the virtual machines that you have in Azure doesn't need now to communicate out to the internet to the public cloud services. They can go through an internal virtual IP that is placed within your virtual network instead of going outbound to the internet. So this means that we can now control the network traffic in a better way than we could before. We also have scheduled agent updates, which means that we can now define when the RDS agent within the host pool should be updated. because by default, this is something that has been controlled by Microsoft. Once they release a new agent, it will gradually roll out new updates on existing machines that are placed in a host pool, but now we can define a little bit more granularly when these updates should happen. New diagnostics information, not that important, but they're now providing us with much more rich data when it comes to troubleshooting, especially GPU sessions where you have a lot of traffic going back and forth. And this allows us to look a little more in depth on what's actually going on. What's the latency between the user session, how much frames per second is coming through the connection. So a lot more insight there. And then we have for Windows 365, there's a lot of changes that was announced. I think it was back in April. Now, Windows 365 is essentially a Windows machine running in Azure, managed by Microsoft. So from a user perspective, they can get automatically provisioned machine, which is then administered using Endpoint Manager, now Intune. Now, one thing that was announced in April is something called offline support. And that means that when a user logs on to the Windows 365 machine, it doesn't work, and then I can download the machine and run it locally instead. So if this was announced back in April, we haven't seen anything yet. We have seen some demos, but I'm guessing it's going to involve some running Hyper-V locally on the client and then spinning up the last changes that have been done on the machine and then starting up the machine locally. And they're also going to be introducing now some new features called direct Windows 365 boot. So meaning that when a user logs onto the local machine, it can automatically start directly to the Windows 365 machine instead. So think about it as a type of thin client connecting directly to your cloud PC. So of course, a lot of innovation, or we can say innovation, but enhancements that have been done on how these services will interact with both Azure, but also when it comes to offline support. But if you look at the protocol specifications on the RDP side, because they're still using RDP underneath everything, it's extremely little that's been changing there the last 6 or 7 months. The only thing that they added on the protocol side, I think it was the last update was in December, was only adding support for Azure Active Directory authentication. So still a little bit work to be done if you want to compete with Blast or HDX on the protocol side. So and then we have Citrix Cloud. Of course, there's been a lot of updates there from the technical side. One thing is something called geolocation redirection, which now allows us to define what kind of applications should be visible for the end user, depending on where they're placed, if you're inside the office or if they're outside the office. So we can define different filters to define what kind of applications should be visible within Workspace. Now, of course, this is for those that have been working for Citrix for a long time. This is, of course, something that's been part of the smart access feature, if my memory serves correctly. But this is something now it's being added as part of the adaptive authentication service, which I'll come to a little bit in the next slide. Citrix also announced integration with Windows 365, something they call HDX Plus. This means that there's an API integration between Citrix Cloud and Windows 365, and for each machine that Windows 365 is provisioning, Citrix will automatically install the VDA agent. So meaning that from a user perspective, they can still use Citrix Workspace to log on to a Windows 365 machine or log on to a machine that is managed by Citrix Cloud and running on Microsoft Azure or on-prem. So this way it allows us to have still the same agent to authenticate to or log on to all those different machines, regardless if it's running Windows 365 or not. Citrix also announced support for hibernation mode on Azure Virtual Machines, of course, reducing the time it takes to actually boot up machines again. Added support for Google Cloud Identity on the Workspace side. We now also have group-based authentication on the sample feature in the Workspace. And they're also making now some changes when it comes to those different connectors and appliances that Citrix has, because before we had the gateway connector, the traditional, the older VDI or the older virtual Linux appliance, which is now deprecated, will be replaced by a new connector appliance, which up until now has only been used by Citrix secure private access, but it will further down the line also be the replacement of those existing Windows cloud connectors as well. So that's direction that this is the direction that they're moving when it comes to the connectors. And also in the latest version, they now also support the delivering MSIX applications and MSIX app attached applications as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening on the Citrix Cloud side. Session recording service. I think this was announced in October last year. Still, you need to have some of the main components running on-prem, but it now provides you with management, and you can view recorded services from the Citrix Cloud management portal. Also a new release when it comes to the Citrix Enterprise Browser. So of course, when it comes to the Enterprise Browser, okay, a lot of people have been confused because sometimes they're talking about the Citrix Browsing Service, which means that you're getting a hosted web browser delivered from Citrix Cloud. You can, of course, publish a browser from within Citrix, or you can use Enterprise Browser, which is a Chromium-based browser running locally on a user device. And both of these two, the last options, when it comes to either using the hosted browser or running it, the local Citrix Enterprise Browser, you can control traffic through that browser using, for instance, secure private access. But one of the new features that came out is that, okay, we can now configure and manage this browser. At least some of the configurations are now available through the global app configuration service. We can manage extensions. We can set up single sign-on. Of course, when it comes to extensions, I've seen so many malicious extensions now coming into the Google Chrome store. So it's a good way to get a little bit more control of what kind of extensions that the end user is actually using. And of course, when it comes to Google, we see that Citrix is investing heavily into supporting Google Cloud and more features now coming from the Chrome OS. One thing you should be aware of, if you like going in direction of Google Cloud and using the Google offering that Citrix has, it doesn't support running EDT yet, which means that you have only TCP-based connection to those gateway services running on Google Cloud. But this might be a temporary limitation until they figure this stuff out. The last thing, which also came up in the release notes when it comes to Citrix Cloud, is that now we have multi-tenant support in the federated authentication service. I don't have the details yet because I just saw the release note come out on the Citrix Cloud portal a couple of weeks before December. So there is something that is coming. It hasn't been rolled out yet, but I've added a link to the release notes there, so you can go in and see how this is going to work out. I already see some comments coming here that this is going to be huge for hosting providers, and I agree completely. This is going to make make this easier for hosting providers. And then we have HTML5 and Microsoft Teams optimization, offloading video and audio to the local client, share file app now available in Microsoft Teams. Citrix even announced support for machine creation services on IBM Cloud. Now, I'm not sure how many are actually using IBM Cloud and now part of this webinar. It would be really interesting to hear feedback there. We used to have an IBM Cloud instance in Norway, but they didn't get enough traction on their customers here in Norway, so they shut down the data center. Another thing is the rendezvous protocol. So in the version 1 of the rendezvous protocol, you needed to have cloud connectors stored or running locally, and the VDA session or the VDI server needed to communicate through those cloud connectors and then connecting back to the gateway service. So of course, a lot of hops there just to be able to communicate between the user and the VDI session. Now with the rendezvous version 2 protocol, it simplifies the traffic flow. And this is now supported for Azure AD joined devices. So you can have a Azure AD joined device, install the VDA agent, and it will now communicate directly to the gateway service. So reducing the amount of hops that it takes, removing the requirement when it comes to infrastructure on the Azure side, and now reducing the latency, so providing even better end user experience. They also even introduced now the support for Linux-based VDA appliances as well, because when you're running virtual infrastructure in Azure, you can also have a Linux machine joined to Azure Active Directory. So a lot of stuff happening there. And then we have the Citrix Adaptive Authentication Service, which if I remember, this was announced probably late Q4 last year when this became available. So I was trying to figure out, okay, what kind of functionality does this actually provide? Now looking at it, we see that, okay, it's spinning up. So when you go into Citrix Cloud and then you set up the service, it's essentially spinning up 2 virtual NetScaler appliances in a Citrix managed Azure environment. And it allows you to set up smart access, EPA scans, end-factor authentication. But it isn't fully integrated yet when it comes to the management side, at least not last time I checked. So it means that you still need to know your way around end-factor authentication in the NetScaler to be able to use the service. And then you can then use this in combination with Citrix Cloud and redirect all authentication from Citrix Cloud or the Workspace app directly to the adaptive authentication mechanism. And this is also where we can set up the geo redirection mechanism as well. And then the final thing, which I find interesting, and I also spoke to some employees at Citrix before I was allowed to actually type this, but with the latest release of virtual apps and desktops, they've now provided us with the ability to use the web-based studio running on-prem. So that means that we don't need to use Citrix Studio anymore. We can then use the web-based portal, which is similar to the ones that we have in Citrix Cloud. And this also means that the Citrix is now reinvesting into the older on-prem or the on-prem customers and their old on-prem products. So for instance, Storefront now, we haven't seen any new development there over probably last 1 or 2 years. And now they also mentioned that they will be reinvesting into Storefront and trying to make it as the same way that they have with the workspace service in cloud as well. So I think that with the reorganization or going private again, they now have the ability to focus more on those or on-prem customers or on-prem organization as well, instead of not just going for all public cloud services. And then we have VMware. Of course, to be honest, there's been a lot of updates and changes there as well. But I probably spent too much time looking into what's new from Citrix that I didn't have the time to collect what's going on from the VMware side. But of course, one of the big announcements that they announced, I think it was in the VMware Explore last year, is that they're now creating a next generation platform when it comes to Horizon Cloud. Previously, you needed to have a lot of virtual infrastructure to be able to host this on different subscriptions, different regions, and now they're simplifying the requirements. You don't need to have multiple machines now to be able to support many virtual machines in Azure. So simplifying the architecture. They also announced app volumes, app on demand. So if you compare application volumes to, let's say, Citrix application layering, it doesn't have any requirements in terms of hypervisors, more OS-based mapping of virtual applications. And with app on demand, you can now have a fresh golden image, the user logs on, clicks on application, and will automatically mount the application. So that way it simplifies, of course, the image management and makes it easier for you to publish any application that you might have. And I'm not sure if it's this service or the functionality is available yet, but I think it's a great or going in the right direction. Horizon also now provided support for a new feature from Amazon called Amazon Workspaces Core. Now, Amazon Workspaces Core is essentially that AWS is providing a set of APIs to the VDI vendors. So I think that Horizon was the first vendor that supports this new API set that Amazon is providing. I also saw a press release from VMware now. I think it was the last couple of days, so last week, in terms of the functionality that's providing on this new platform. But looking at what kind of news and updates that VMware is pushing, it's more directed at the digital end user experience, right? When it comes to onboarding users, providing insight on what actually users are doing. They also released the Freestyle Orchestrator, which now can make it easy to create onboarding of new users. So there's a lot of focus within that area. They also announced the same type of integration or the same type of functionality with Windows 365, similar to what Citrix has with HX Plus. But I don't think it's been released yet. But they will also want to provide the same level of functionality. And then we have some other updates that have been going on, which I managed to add as part of the session here. Of course, Teradici now has been acquired by HP, and now it's been rebranded into the Teradici, of course, is they were the initial inventor of the PC over IP protocol. So this is now part of HP and now part of something called HP Anywhere. Corel, which is the owner of Parallels and Parallels Desktop, they also now acquired a new company called Avingu. Avingu is focusing purely on providing browser-based access to internal application services. So I'm guessing that they want to merge the functionality between Avingu and Parallels further down the line. Nerdio, which of course has been focusing on providing management capabilities on top of AUD, also now announced support for Azure Stack Hyperconverged. Google announced something they call Chrome OS Flex, which now allows you to turn any Windows or Mac computer to a Chrome-based device instead. So essentially just download the OS, plug it on a USB stick, similar to what many thin client vendors have today, and then you can convert it to a Chrome OS instead. We actually have a customer that in Norway, which converted their existing Windows machines to Chrome OS because they were impacted by a ransomware attack sometime in at the end of 2021. So they didn't want to have the risk anymore with running Windows, so they essentially converted everyone to a Chrome OS device instead. And as I said, AWS announced Workspace Core, providing predefined APIs for VDI vendors to integrate with. And they're now building new functionality as well to make it easier for providers to actually use this API, of course, to provision VDI desktops on their platform. And then we have some of the new capabilities. Microsoft announced something called Azure DevBox. I think it was in August last year. Now, in that time, Microsoft had Windows 365, and this allowed you for easy provisioning of virtual machine. Of course, they want to target the developers more and make Azure more attractable platform for developers. And with Azure DevBox, you get the same functionality as Windows 365, but the only addition that you actually get is self-service mechanism. So you can go into the Windows 365 portal or the Azure DevBox portal, which is it's of course a separate portal, and then you can order a virtual machine based upon a predefined template or predefined image that you have. So you can, as a developer or any type of user, go in and provision virtual machines, either for a specific time period or having a persistent machine. So that is essentially what DevBox is at the moment. And then at Ignite last year, they also announced something called deployment environments. This is, well, it's building on the same principles as Azure DevBox, but it will allow us to create any predefined templates for any service that we have. Let's say that we want to have a full automated test environment, right? But I don't want to give my testers or my developers access to Azure portal and start spinning up everything that they find interesting. So I want to have a predefined template. And with this functionality, I can create a predefined template. I can make it available for users to order. The only problem is that as of now, this is only available through the CLI. But in time, this will also be available as part of the Azure portal. And then we have, hybrid workloads. Of course, at the moment, if you, let's say you want to run AVD on-prem, right? Because of course, from a licensing perspective, it makes a lot of sense, but you still need to have workloads running locally. Of course, now it works with the short path protocol. So of course, reduces the latency that you previously had. Of course, it's not a technical limitation. It's more like a support or licensing limitation that you can't use AVD running, let's say, on VMware or Citrix 10 server. The currently only supported platform is Azure Stack Hyperconverged. But I think that sometime soon, because right now we see that Microsoft is investing heavily into Azure Arc, which is Microsoft's way of providing hybrid management, which now also supports VMware. From a management perspective. So I think that sometime soon we'll also see that, okay, we also want to provide this functionality on VMware as well. But that's not something that they announced, but I just assume that it's coming sometime soon. But because like most customers that I'm working with, they don't run Azure Stack Hyperconverged. They use VMware or use Nutanix for their data centers. Another interesting thing is that Microsoft also announced that they will be coming with their own hardware running Azure Stack Hyperconverged sometime soon this year. So instead of buying it from Dell, HP, or Lenovo, you can now buy everything from Microsoft as its own appliance. And when it comes to like hybrid workloads, for let's say Citrix, now Citrix also supports Azure Stack Hyperconverged, but that's only through the System Center Virtual Machine Manager APIs. And if you look at the roadmap for System Center Virtual Machine Manager, well, there isn't any roadmap. There's really not much being done on the System Center side. So I think also that sometime soon we'll see that Azure Stack Hyperconverged will have like more APIs or functionality to provide like more management compared to what we have today with System Center. And of course, Azure Stack Hyperconverged also now supports GPU-based workloads with GPU partitioning, which is a new feature in Windows Server. It's similar to what we have with vGPU, and I think it's a collaboration between Microsoft and NVIDIA to make this functionality provide, as we have had with VMware and XenClient server. And also some additional changes. Citrix also announced support for public clouds for customers running the, let's say, the LTSR releases, which means you can now provision virtual machines on public cloud as long as you have the hybrid rights cloud subscription. So that's the only way that you can get access to this new functionality, or allow you to still continue on provisioning virtual machines through an on-prem Citrix installation. And then we have Intune. Of course, as I said, there's a new SKU coming there, premium SKU being launched in March, which will now include remote help, Microsoft Tunnel, which is now a VPN tunnel for mobile devices. It's now available through the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint agent on Android and iOS. You have also the new feature that was announced, so endpoint privilege management, meaning that if the user needs to have local administrator rights, they will have this kind of wizard available through their machines, so they can enter a justification or define why they need admin privileges. So this is now being built into the operating system. And of course, more endpoint analysis. I'm guessing more information, but it's still a bit early to say what kind of functionality that's coming in there. But you know, this is not something that will be available for those running the most expensive licenses that you have and Intune today with the E5 licenses. You need to buy like an E7 or what kind of new name that Microsoft is going to be proposing here. But remote help is of course now provides integration as well for ServiceNow, so you can trigger the remote help setup from ServiceNow. I actually also saw a question here that I want to answer straight away. If Microsoft's actually developing progressive web apps anymore. So they actually, for Linux-based workloads, I think that's on the next slide. Yeah, never mind, I see it here. But they actually killed the Teams client for Linux, and now they created a new progressive web app for Teams, which is available for Linux. But anyway, the remote help integration. This is now also supported for Android devices. And another thing when it comes to specifically Intune, And now, like previously, for those that are going from System Center Configuration Manager and a lot of group policies, moving to Azure AD-based devices, of course, you have a lot of configuration that you want to essentially collect and reuse within Intune. And up until now, you would need to look into the policies and create OMA URI policies based upon what you have and what is available. But now we have more easily importable mechanisms, so you can import existing group policies and convert them to running in Intune directly. And Microsoft also released something called Windows Auto Patch, which means that you now are leaving the patching of Windows operating systems, Office, and Microsoft Edge browser to Microsoft, if you, of course, trust that Microsoft is managing those licenses or those patches and they are working, if they are working correctly as well. I don't know how many times that I've installed a patch and other stuff breaks or you get a blue screen or something like that, but hopefully it's matured a lot since the last time I tried it. Within Windows, and this is now is this something that was released for the latest Windows 11 version, which is now, and there's a new service called Smart App Control. And this is a new feature that is based upon application locker or app locker in Windows. But app locker needed to define, okay, what kind of trusted vendors or applications do I want to allow the user to actually run? And if you don't run a signed application on a specific vendor, the application won't start. So of course, there's a lot of management. You need to make sure that you're not locking out any specific applications. Now with Smart App Control, it means that you're now having Microsoft to manage this list of trusted applications and trusted vendors instead. So it's going to be interesting to see there. When I initially tried the new feature there, they were actually blocking Visual Studio on my machine. So it still has a little kinks that needs to be worked out properly. Remote help, which is something that was announced in April last year, allows you to have now remote connections to devices through Intune or Endpoint Manager, which was called back in the day. Of course, when this was announced, they said that, okay, to actually use this feature, you need to have an additional license per user per month, $3.50 per user per month. So looking at the comments section on the blog article is pretty interesting because there was 56 comments and most of them were not really positive when it comes to the change here because it was extremely expensive compared to what most customers have today. Now, after this article came out, they made some changes saying that, okay, this is going to be free for customers within the education sector. And I'm guessing with the new premium SKU as well, they might be bundling this and making it even cheaper if you buy the full license product instead. I also wanted to add like an updated section when it comes to MSIX, if it's still a viable alternative to AppV. But I reached out to Timothy Mangan, which is one of the gurus when it comes to AppV, and he created a report card last year which compares AppV to MSIX, but is working on a new update now, which will hopefully come out at the end of the month, which we can then look at and see what kind of features that we're missing out on. And then we have Azure Active Directory. Of course, there's a lot of updates that have been going on there the last year or so. Of course, the big thing now, which I know is impacting a lot of customers, is that they're now removing basic authentication, which is now be removed from Exchange Online during this month. But there's a lot of interesting new features that have been coming out, like certificate-based authentication now for Azure Active Directory. So if you have devices that you can have a smart card on, you can now authenticate directly to Azure Active Directory. I've also seen blog articles showcasing this, so you can authenticate with a certificate on an Azure AD device through Citrix FAS and then to a VDI session there. So it opens up a lot of interesting use cases. And also a couple of specific topics that I want to talk about, and one of them is cross-tenant federation and Teams shared channels. Because previously, like let's say you're working as a consultant and you need to join a Teams meeting or you need to join a Teams group on within a specific customer, you'll be using an old feature called B2B collaboration, which also means you need to have a specific authentication prompt or MFA prompt from that specific organization once you're invited into. So
And also you have a guest user account within that organization that you're working in. So it opens up a lot of interesting use cases, especially if you have like multiple organizations that you're collaborating with. Now with a new feature, which is called B2B Direct Connect, this is providing much of the same functionality that we have within Active Directory and federation or trust between domains and forests. So a user can have its own object within its own domain and authenticate to another domain. And this is much of the same features that Microsoft is now building in Azure Active Directory. And the first feature that is using this B2B direct connection is Microsoft Teams shared channels. So that allows me to have, I can still use Teams within my organization, but I can have channels which can then are linked between different organizations. And in addition to this, I can also define that when I'm logging on to this shared channel, or setting up this federation, I can define that, okay, when someone is authenticating into this organization, we can trust the user device that the user is coming from. We can trust the MFA that the user is coming from. So also reducing the amount of authentication prompts that you have when you're connecting to a remote organization. The second part, or the second feature I want to mention, is hybrid cloud trust, or I think the real name is actually hybrid cloud Kerberos trust. Now, let's say that you have an Azure AD device and you need to authenticate to an on-prem file server, for instance. Now, previously, you would need to set up PKI service or Active Directory certificate services, issue a certificate to every device, and then allow this type of authentication. Now, with this new simplified model, we don't need to have this PKI service anymore. We can then have an Azure AD joint device that can do single sign-on to on-prem workloads. Let's say SMB file share or SharePoint or whatever internal web application that you might have, which is using Kerberos or any other of the more legacy authentication protocols. But of course, to actually set this up, you need to have Windows Hello enabled to actually allow the authentication mechanism to work. So this is underneath actually using the Azure AD Kerberos mechanism, which was recently released as well. Then we also have a lot of interesting updates when it comes to Microsoft Azure. First off, we have new storage disks which are now coming. It's still in preview, but I've created a summary table on the right-hand side just showcasing the performance differences and the cost difference between the existing premium disks and the new disks. So of course, the biggest change is that version 2 disk starts on 3000 IOPS, and the old ones, well, depending on what kind of size you define, is of course a lot lower. But in most cases, the premium V2 disks are faster and cheaper. And of course, I also see a lot of question when it comes to getting access to GPU cards as part of virtual machines used in Azure. And like in my own experience now, I've been trying to getting access to the new GPU cards running the NVIDIA A10 card, the NV5, and it's always been a hard battle to get through the quota for specific projects that I have, and this is now for the data center in West Europe. So I think that it's still limited in terms of how many GPUs they actually have access to. But of course, a lot of interesting new capabilities that have been coming out now for Azure as well. Now I want to go into the last part, which is Zero Trust Network Access. Now, of course, there's a lot of different articles and publications and products from different vendors now promoting this Zero Trust Network Access, meaning that instead of having a full VPN client between the user and your infrastructure, you will always have different mechanisms to verify the user's identity, where the user is coming from, if there's any risk associated with the user identity, and also checking the user's device as well. And not just checking if the user has patched with the latest updates and making sure the antivirus is running, but constantly verifying that all these attributes are in place before the user is actually allowed to gain access. But still providing access to all those type of internal applications and services that you might have within your organization, either if it's web-based, TCP, UDP-based, or Windows applications or SMB-based files. So if we go through, let's say, an example, let's say that we have like a user that doesn't work in HR, but for some reason at 2 a.m., they're now downloading a bunch of files or folders or information from the HR share that is stored on a local SharePoint site or internal Windows file server. Now, of course, with let's say a traditional deployment, let's say the end user has a VPN client, it doesn't provide the same level of mechanisms to detect what's actually going on within the session. And if it's detecting any type of malicious traffic or any abnormal activities, then going in and directly disconnecting the session. So this is some of the functionality that CTNA is trying to solve and trying to provide this mechanism to always be on the lookout for any suspicious behavior or unrecognizable traffic. When it comes to what kind of alternatives that we have, of course, there's a lot of different vendors in the market now that provide this type of functionality. Of course, Citrix has secure private access. VMware has their own secure access mechanism. And then we have Palo Alto, which says that, okay, the old CTNA version is now legacy, and we have a new model called CTA2, which of course will solve every problem that the old version has. So what I did is looking into, okay, what kind of mechanisms does Microsoft have, and what kind of mechanisms does Citrix have, and what kind of mechanisms does Cloudflare have, which is a new vendor also investing heavily into this type of features and functionality. So I did a kind of comparison between the three different vendors and what kind of functionality provide. So if we look at, let's say, Microsoft, so at the core, we have Azure Active Directory, we have Intune and Microsoft Defender for endpoint, looking at the health of the user, the health of the device, and then we have conditional access policies that we define those different attributes, what should be checked, and what kind of compliance checks should be made before the user is allowed to gain access. When it comes to actually authenticating to all those different internal services that you might have, even if it's VPN or web-based or SMB file shares, you name it, there's a lot of different options, especially if you're looking at Microsoft Azure. So for web applications, you can have everything built into Azure Active Directory. If you want to go into a jump host, then you need to use Azure Bastion. Internal applications, well, they can use App Proxy. VDI is, of course, separate. There are different portals and applications that you have if you need to use Windows 365 or if you need to use AVD. So there's a lot of different components in the mix here if you want to provide, let's say, a user with access to all those internal applications. And from an end user perspective, well, it gets kind of clunky because there's so many different portals, applications, components that you need to actually use to actually make this work properly. So if we look at this, let's say from a Citrix side, a little bit more simplified. Of course, you can use a lot of different identity providers to actually, let's say you want to use Azure Active Directory, you want to use Google Identity, and they, of course, have different security mechanisms to make sure that there's no risk associated with the user that's trying to authenticate. Then you have the device context. So looking at what's actually going on the end user device. And then you have something called the Secure Access Client, which is a remake of the old Netscaler Gateway component, which then does the check on the end user device before the user is allowed to authenticate. And now, depending on if you want to log into internal VDI or internal VDI service or published desktop or application, all of this is going through the Citrix Workspace app. But depending on if you want to use internal web applications or TCP UDP-based protocols, it will then be routed through the other connector appliance, not this traditional Citrix Cloud connectors. So depending on the traffic load, it will go through different appliances that you have running within your infrastructure. And of course, on the positive side, Citrix supports most different identity providers, provides single sign-on, and you have everything stored within the Workspace app. Of course, the problem is that, and the biggest issue that I have with the product at the moment is that it doesn't support device context checks from other third-party vendors. So let's say you're running Carbon Black, or you're running Defender for Endpoint, or some other third party that you're a type of EDR service running on the end user device. You want to leverage that information that you get, right? But that's not something that is supported as of now, if I remember correctly. And then we have the last option, or the third option that I've been researching into, and that's Cloudflare. They have their own product called Zero Trust. So since Cloudflare, they don't have any antivirus VDR capabilities. They don't provide any identity services. So what they do is essentially integrate with all of these different third-party options. You can use Azure AD, you can use GitHub, Google Identity, you can use Carbon Black, Intune, whatever, and it can collect all this context from those different services. And then you can define a policy saying, okay, I want this and this checks to be complied before to have been fulfilled before the user is allowed to authenticate. Now, of course, Cloudflare, given that they focus purely on the network side, so they don't have any VDI service, but they're pretty good when it comes to routing applications to services on the inside. And they're also using a new protocol, which means that the traffic is going a lot faster compared to what Citrix and Microsoft has. But it's still, when it comes from the management side, it's still a little bit funky in setting all these services up. But it's been probably about 6 months since I've tried setting up the new functionality that's been announcing. But they're also coming with a new remote browser feature, and also they have a new CASB service coming sometime soon. So it's going to be a vendor that we should pay attention to moving forward. Also, of course, a lot of customers that I'm working on are moving all of their workloads to public cloud and moving to Azure AD-based devices, but they still need to have an on-prem file service because you can't move everything to OneDrive and Microsoft Teams anyway. So you need to have these locally storage services that you can connect directly through Windows Explorer, but you still want to have the same level of security and supporting Azure Active Directory. So I also did a lot of research there. Okay, what kind of features, what kind of storage providers can actually use on-prem, but still support Azure AD-based authentication? So of course, there's a lot of different options. Again, I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'll just leave this table here. When it comes to what kind of vendors that are in the market, I'm guessing there's a lot of other third-party providers that I've missed out as well. But for one specific customer, we ended up with this. So we used Azure AD devices, we used Intune and Defender, we had conditional access. Now we had a little bit split between so the management teams are using AVD, the IT administrators are using Bastion because most of the workloads in Azure, and the developers are essentially using Cloudflare to gain access to the internal application systems that they are developing. And we also used Ignite when it comes to file storage because they had a pretty decent offering still integrating with Azure Active Directory. So it means that we can use much of the same security context that we have built up with Azure Active Directory and conditional access. So this is the final slide in terms of what I think that we're going to be seeing in the upcoming year. I think that for Citrix side, of course, with all the announcements when the layoffs the last 24 hours, it's still going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the next year. But we see that Citrix is focusing heavily on other cloud providers. And I think that's one of the key benefits that they have, that they support Google, Amazon, IBM Cloud, which came out this year. So I think this is now a way for them to build more feet to stand on, because they see that for Azure, there's so much competition. We have Nerdio, we have native AVD, we have VMware. But for other cloud providers, Citrix is only the viable option, especially for Google Cloud at the moment. Now, VMware, of course, is still focusing more on the user experience compared to like innovation on the provisioning or integration with the cloud provider. But still, they also see that Microsoft is where the most VDI-based workloads will be in the future. So, of course, they're providing much more integration there compared to the other platforms. And of course, Microsoft, I don't think there's going to be a lot of revolutionary new functionality there. I think it's going to be purely like pushing the capabilities that they have up until now, maybe figuring out some bugs and use cases. But I think it's still something that's going to be, a lot of the functionality will still need to be solved by third-party partners such as Nerdio and others, because their main goal is still getting workloads to run in Microsoft Azure, because it's compute intensive, and of course means that can use much more of the capacity that they have within the data centers. But looking at the overall strategy for EUC, for Microsoft, I still think it's a little bit fragmented in terms of making our good user experience provide access to all those different internal applications and services. Whew. So with that, I already spent 4 minutes over time, but I also see there's a question here in terms of the recording. If it will be shared out, the slide deck is available there, and you can also use this contact information if you want to contact me and ask me any follow-up questions that you might have. Whew, now I can breathe again.
Thank you, Marius. It was a lot of information and a lot of good stuff. I really enjoyed having you back today, and it was so great to start 2023 webinars with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much again, and for having me for another year. So hopefully you continue on this for the next year as well.
Hope so. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Again, I'll share out the recording, and I'll put the link to the deck in there as well. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and good luck and good endeavors for everyone for the whole year. All right. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.